Well, as a child of the 80s, sometimes I miss the old 80s TV shows. They weren't all great, but I still miss them. And one of the shows I miss a lot is the A-Team. How many people watched the A-Team back in the day? You know, they had that van, and they were this team that went around and fought crime and everything. Anyway, their leader, you know, the guy who was kind of the boss of them, Hannibal Smith, he had a signature saying. Do you remember what his signature saying was? I love it when a plan comes together, right? And he had the cigar hanging out his mouth, and, you know, everything would work out just as they hoped it would. And it's funny because as I thought of that, Debbie and I was thinking back to a time that Debbie and I experienced a moment like that for ourselves. And it was back in the spring of 2009 when we were still living out back in Arizona. And we decided, I had gotten some time off of work, and we decided, man, you know what would be really cool? Let's come back here and visit some family. So we thought that'd be a great idea, but the issue was the girls were still in school. So it would be a big deal to pull them out of school and have them miss and all these kinds of things. But we decided we were going to do it, you know, that would make it a big deal, but we were going to make it even better, is that we weren't going to tell the girls about this trip until the very last minute. So we wanted to keep it a surprise from them. So what we did was the day of departure came, and we had to take the girls to school. So we took them to school, dropped them off, and then Debbie and I, we rushed home to pack all of the bags. And it was so much fun. And in the midst of all of that, and there's a picture of the girls that year at school too. Isn't that nice? They're embarrassed, but that's okay. Anyway, we packed all the bags and everything like that, and then we made all these arrangements too. You know, we had to get the tickets, obviously, and without them knowing, we had to set up a house sitter to take care of our dogs and everything, and then we needed a ride. So we had my friend Jamie go with us to the airport, and then he could drive our car home. So he's in the car with us that day when we picked the girls up from school, because our flight was right after school. So he's in the car. So we see the girls coming out, and they're all tired from the long day at school, and I know they're dreading all the homework they'd have to do. And they kind of go to get in the car, and they get in the car, and then they look, and they're like, "What's Jamie doing here?" And we're like, "Oh, well, we need to take him to the airport," which is not technically a lie, right? So anyway, so we go, and they go, "All right, whatever." So we go, and we head into Phoenix, and we get to the airport, and we pull up to the curb. And Debbie and I kind of get out, and we go to the back of the car, and we start unloading all the luggage from the trunks, and they don't notice that we're doing that. And then Jamie gets out of the car, and I yelled at Jamie so the girls could hear. I said, "You know, Jamie, I think we're going to go away instead of you. Come on, girls." You know, and the girls hear that, and they're like, "What is he talking about?" And then they look out the car, and they see all their luggage sitting out on the curb, and then I hand them a ticket, you know, their plane ticket to Philly, and they look at it. And their whole countenance changes. They start jumping up up and down with joy and everything like that. And I kind of look at Debbie, and I'm thinking, man, I love it when a plan comes together. It was perfect. They were so surprised. It was pretty cool. Or at least they pretended they were surprised. I don't know. But I felt good. But anyway, I want that kind of sentiment, that idea of I love it when a plan comes together, to be going through your mind this morning as we begin a brand new series. So why don't you turn to the Old Testament book of Esther this morning? All right, Esther's about in the middle of the Old Testament. If you can find the book of Psalms, just go back two. Just go back 2 books from the book of Psalms, and you'll find Esther. And Esther is the last of what's called the historical books of the Old Testament. And what that means is they recount the history, their narratives, recounting the history of God's people, Israel. And as you're kind of turning, I want to give you kind of this recap of the history of Israel so we know where we are in Esther. You know, we have Abraham, and God came to Abraham and gave him a promise, right? And he says, "From you I'll make a great nation, and from this nation I'll bless you, and I will bless all the nations of the world," or all peoples of the world will be blessed through you. That's because the Messiah was going to come through this line. So God establishes this nation through Abraham. And then as the people grow and they become a nation, they're in captivity in Egypt at the beginning of Exodus, and God leads them out, right, with Moses, and they go through the wilderness and come to the promised land. And as they're getting to the promised land, God says, "I know I made this promise with you, and this is going to happen. It's a guarantee. But I also want to make another deal with you, a covenant with you." It's two-way, though. Here's what it is. if you guys continue to keep my word and don't worship any other gods, I'm going to prosper you in this land in which you're about to enter. But if you don't do that, then I'm going to send trouble your way, and I'm going to take you out of it. So sure enough, as soon as the children of Israel go into the promised land, they start failing in this promise, and they start getting tempted to worship other gods and all of these kinds of things, to the point with, after King Solomon, because of their sin, the nation splinters into two separate nations. You have the northern kingdom, which was called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. And again, because of all of this sin kept growing, God allowed them to be taken into captivity. First, it was the northern kingdom of Israel. God raised up the Assyrian Empire, was the world power at the time, and they came in and invaded and took the people of Israel off into captivity. And then years later, it was the Babylonian Empire. And Babylon came in, and they ransacked the temple, destroyed the temple, and took Judah to Babylon, to captivity. And this is where we have the king of Babylon was King Nebuchadnezzar, and this is where we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the fiery furnace, and we have Daniel, and some of these stories. But for 70 years, they're in Babylon. And as they're getting to the end of that 70 years, another world power comes to bear, the Medo-Persian Empire, just so we kind of get our ancient history. And they come and they defeat Babylon. And they were led by their king, King Darius. And we see King Darius with Daniel, right? He's the one with the lion's den and all of that. So this is King Darius. And when King Darius came in and takes over, he says to the Jews, you know what? I'm going to allow the Jews to go back to their homeland. Whoever wants to go back to your homeland can go back to your homeland. So, a first wave of Jews return, led by a guy named Zerubbabel. And he leads them back to their homeland. And then a few years later, Ezra leads another group back. And this is all chronicled in the book of Ezra. And in chapter 2, all of this happens. And later, another group, after the time of Esther even, goes back, led by Nehemiah. But these first two groups go back. So that what that leaves, it leaves a remnant, though, because they didn't all the Jews didn't go back. Some of the Jews stayed, and there's this remnant. And they stayed for various reasons. Some were old and couldn't travel. Some had big families, couldn't travel, or they had things that would restrict them. Some just got so comfortable living in this new land, they were like, we're okay here. But these Jews that remained still had issues. In fact, they had two major challenges facing them in this strange land. The first was the question of how could they hold on to their culture as Jews and still assimilate into this new nation or this new Persian society. So how are they going to hold on to all those things if they're separated, especially if some of the best and brightest already went back? How are they going to retain all of that? And they didn't know how they were going to do that. But the second challenge was even greater, and that was despair. And the people that were left started to despair. They started to say, man, we're here all alone. In fact, I think even God forgot us, and he's not working anywhere. He's nowhere to be seen, and we can't even see him working. And it's with this group, this remnant that's left in Persia, where the book of Esther picks up, okay? So that kind of gives a setting for the book of Esther. And this is going to be kind of a lot of background this morning, but we're going to get through it all. Anyway, the book of Esther is really cool because, again, it's a narrative. It tells a story, and what a story, man. There is a little bit of everything we're going to find in Esther. I mean, there are wild parties. There is immense beauty. There's, dangerous plots afoot. There's heroes and villains. There's love and courage. There's life and death situations. I mean, Esther kind of has just about everything. But more than this, Esther is about how God is still present and he's still working even when we can't see him, especially in the time of crisis. And that's really what Esther is about, this crisis time for his people. And we can have crisis in our lives today, can't we? We can go through things that are crisis and these difficult times. And sometimes we can be tempted to say, God isn't here. God isn't working. I don't know what he's doing. I keep praying, and I don't know. Maybe he forgot about me. But we can know this. Even though we can have crisis, God never does have a crisis. And nothing that happens in our lives ever catches God by surprise. Now, there's a couple of unique things in Esther that are interesting. First of all, in Esther, there's even though it's about the Jews, there's no real mention of Jewish culture, like their traditions and their some of their observances as Jewish people and their worship, and there's no mention of the name of God in Esther, although his presence is unmistakable as we look at this story, and his control and care for his people living in a distant land. In fact, by the time we get through Esther, and we're going to see how God is working, we're going to sit there and say, I love it when a plan comes together. And that's kind of what we're left with Esther. Now, Esther's also unique because it's only one of two books in all of Scripture that are named for a woman, the other being Ruth. And Esther is named after this Jewish orphan girl who becomes queen of the most mighty empire the world had ever seen up to this point. In fact, the Jewish festival, the Feast of Purim, is a celebration of Esther's life and the deliverance of the Jewish people through her. So, if you've ever heard of the Feast of Purim, in fact, it's at this time of year, early spring, that in Jewish synagogues and temples around the world, you know what they do? They read aloud the Book of Esther so they can be reminded of God's faithfulness. And when they do it in the Jewish synagogues to this day, they still have, where they get up to the name of Esther, everybody cheers. And then when they say the name of the villain, everybody boos. Now, you don't have to do that today as we go through this. But we're going to go through the Book of Esther. So now we're ready to go through. So hopefully you're open to it. And we're going to start with verse 1. We'll stop along the way and kind of give some commentary as we read through this first chapter. It begins, now in the days of Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus there, I got it right. Okay, another word for Ahasuerus is Xerxes. Sometimes that's easier to say. Anyway, Ahasuerus. So now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the royal throne in Susa, the capital. So here, basically, Esther's giving the Book of Esther is giving us the setting, and we're not sure who wrote Esther. They think it might be a guy named Mordecai who we're going to meet, but we're not sure. It never says. But so what we have here is we have the setting. Now Darius, he had a son, and after Darius died, his son takes control. His name's Ahasuerus, and he is now the king of Persia. And we know that Ahasuerus reigned from 586 BC to 565 BC. So this is giving us a little time frame. And under him, the empire of Persia became basically the largest kingdom the world had ever seen. It describes that it goes all the way from India. So if you picture a map, India and Asia, all the way, it covers Turkey, and then it goes down south, all of North Africa, all the way down to Ethiopia. Okay, it's huge. It says there's 127 provinces, which are like states. Okay, so it has 127 provinces in it. It's huge. And then another thing it notes is that Ahasuerus had moved the capital city from Babylon to a city called Susa. Now, Susa isn't around anymore. There's some ruins still there, but it's located in far southwest Iran, just off the top of the Persian Gulf. So right on the border between Iraq and Iran, and Susa's right there. And Susa was known as the most beautiful city of the world at the time. Even Alexander the Great, when he came into Susa, noted that. So anyway, that's kind of our setting. Verse 3, it says, now in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So 3 years into his reign, about 583 or so, Ahasuerus decides to have a feast. Now, this is very important. In the book of Esther, there are 8 feasts mentioned. And the writer of Esther uses these feasts as kind of points of tension in the story, points of tension and relief in the story. So around these feasts, big things happen to kind of display God's work. So God's work kind of hangs around these feasts. So we want to note all the feasts that are kind of mentioned because they're all kind of important in this story. And this is the first of the feasts, right? And it's quite a feast that lasts 6 months, 180 days. Imagine a party lasting 180 days. But this is no ordinary party. I mean, they're just not being wild men and all this kind of stuff. He invites only the elite in the society, all the governors and all the army officials and princes in the kingdom. And he invites all these important people in the kingdom to this feast. And what many people think he's doing at this feast is that he's using this feast as it's early in his reign to build support, to kind of show himself, you knew my father Darius, but now know me, and I'm a guy who's got it together as well. And I'm a guy that you can get behind. And the reason why he's trying to build support is because he's getting ready to go on a military conquest, a major military conquest. You see, late in his dad's life, in Darius tried to invade Greece. And he was defeated. Do you remember the Battle of Marathon? You ever hear the Battle of Marathon? That's where King Darius was defeated in Greece, so he never got to take it. So now you have Ahasuerus is trying to build support because he's building an army to finish his father's business. He says, we're going to invade Greece. In fact, a few years later, he takes, they say at least 500,000 army and navy people, some say several million, west to go attack Greece. And it's actually a failed attempt, but he attempts to go and do that. So they're believing this feast is really a time where he's showing his power and his might and that he has it all together, so that these people will support him and help build this army throughout this empire. So he has this feast, and this feast was followed by 2 more feasts. Verse 5, it says, and when the days were completed, or when this feast was completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel or the capital, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So he has this other feast that's much shorter. It's only 7 days. And everybody who lives in Susa, no matter who you are, is invited to this. And this is a feast that's going to be a wild feast. In fact, he says, I'm putting no limits on the drinking. If you don't want to drink, you don't have to feel compelled to drink. But it also means if you want to drink at these things and get drunk, nobody's going to stop you. So it becomes this wild time. But it also becomes a time where he invites him into the palace to see the beauty of everything he has. So it's a chance for him to show off. In fact, the next couple verses talk about that. Talks about the royal linens and the table settings and the wine they have, and all the gardens and marble and all these great things that he has for people to look at. And he's inviting these people. Now, this feast we find is just for men. In fact, in the Persian culture, when you would have a feast or a party like this and it was going to be really wild, then it was usually they would separate the men and women because they didn't want women around when the men are just getting wild and rioting and all of these things. So there was a second feast going on, concurrent with this feast that Ahasuerus is going. Look at verse 9. It says, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So she has a feast going on at the same time as Ahasuerus is having a feast, but she's entertaining all of the women. And it says the women of the palace, which includes concubines and things like that, which is a little uncomfortable. But she's having this feast, and all the women are coming to, and she's showing off as well. So she has her own crowd. And later on, it goes to say, at the end of this feast, on the 7th day, the last day of the feast, here's what happens. It says the king was very happy. He was filled with wine. Okay, I doubt he's like overly drunk, but he's happy. And he is proud of himself. And he says, everybody has seen all that I have, but wait, there's more. I have the grand finale for you all to see. My greatest possession idea. And what he does is he he sends 7 of his guards or his eunuchs to go and to summon Queen Vashti. And he says, bring her to me with her crown so that everybody can gaze on her beauty, so he can show off her beauty. So he says, I want to show you, this is the grand finale of all that I have. Look at my beautiful wife. Isn't she amazing? So it's like the mic drop moment. So the guys go to get Queen Vashti, but look what happens in verse 12. It says, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this time, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him. So these guys come and they get Queen Vashti. Hey, Queen Vashti, come, make yourself look nice, wear the crown, and he wants to show you off. And she says, no. Now, we're not told why. And the reason why we're not told why is because this isn't a major figure, a major character in this story. Okay, in the story of Esther. The fact is she refuses. Now, it may be, I mean, who would want to come and be ogled by a bunch of drunk guys, you know? So we can kind of think of some of the reasons why she doesn't want to come. But anyway, the result of this is what's important. The king is furious. It says his anger burns against him, right? And he's just like, how could she do this? He's probably furious most of all because he's embarrassed, right? He looks bad. You know, who's she showing me up? So he calls 7 of his most trusted advisors, these princes around him. And here's what he asks. He says in verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Basically, what legally can I do? So he's not being too impulsive here and just saying off with her head. He's saying, all right, well, legally, what are my recourses? How can I make her look bad? Because this isn't a good thing. And one of his advisors, guy named Memucan, speaks up. And he says, you know, King, this is pretty serious, what she's done. Because what she did wasn't just an affront to you. It was an affront to all the noblemen in the kingdom. Because once our wives find out that Queen Vashti did it, they're going to be emboldened to say, I can do this too. And they're going to be disrespectful to us. And then it's going to be chaos. So know this, you need to address this, and you need to be pretty firm with your response. So here's what he proposes, verse 19. It says, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes so it may not be repealed. I want you to make a law about this. That Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. She's to be deposed, to be kicked out of the palace. No longer considered queen. Not only that, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, so he's buttering him up, he says, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. And it says, well, this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So the king makes a law, and he says, basically, here's the law. You have to respect your husband. Now, you may sit there and say, that's just wrong. No, it's not wrong necessarily. In fact, respecting your husband, it's a good thing. It's biblical. Paul talks about this, right? In Ephesians, where he says, you know, the husband is to love his wife as Christ loves the church. And then he says in 5:33, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So this is a biblical principle. But the biblical principle is in the framework of that respect isn't demanded. It's something that's earned through sacrificial love. So the bad thing is they're saying, you must do this. You have to. They're legislating it. Okay, and then chapter 1 ends. Then Ahasuerus, he strips Vashti of her position as queen, and then he sends these letters out to all the provinces, saying basically, and here's what it says, that every man is to be master of his own household. So this is how they solve this problem with disrespect. I mean, you can't make this up, can you? I mean, Esther hits the ground running with the drama. There is drama everywhere here, isn't it? Well, in this, what are we supposed to learn? I mean, what do we really learn through all of this here? Through this surreal scene? Well, there's a couple things that we can kind of glean from all of this that are happening that we can kind of learn from. And the first is kind of on a practical level. We can kind of look at some principles of what's happening through these feasts and through what happens. And that's, we can discover how easy it is for us to work out of our own weakness instead of God's strength when we don't see him. In fact, here's one of the things that we see through these feasts and through Ahasuerus, is that we learn that when we fail to recognize God's presence in our lives, we have some warning signs. Because when we fail to recognize God's presence in our lives, we tend to do one of three things usually. The first is to rely on our own accomplishments. When we don't recognize God's presence in our lives, we act from our own pride, right? Just like King Ahasuerus. He's starting to say, look what I built. Look at my power. Look at my might. Look what I was able to do. Because he didn't know God. And in our own lives, we can do this. We can kind of use our accomplishments or think that what we do in our life is what we build and what we accomplish, and we can use it to impress people. We take credit for what God is accomplishing in and through us. Look what I was able to do. I was able to witness to somebody today. I'm a great Christian. And we're taking that accomplishment for ourselves because we're not recognizing it's God. Our pride causes us to miss this, that we are nothing and we can do nothing apart from God. So we see this kind of in Ahasuerus, and when we do this, it's like kind of propping up a facade of our life. And that's what really these feasts are a facade. And it's humorous in a way, if it wasn't so sad, because it's this kingdom of Persia, and Ahasuerus is setting it up. This is the perfect place to be. Look at all that we have. We have it all together, right? And he's showing all this, and he's talking a big game, and he gets to the big finale, the big clincher, his beautiful wife, right? And it hits a snag, and it all crumbles. Everybody's like, oh, this is a bad look. And basically, you just undid 187 days of feasting and neat things that you did. And shows that, it's not all perfect. And that's what can happen in our lives when we prop ourselves up. And that happens when we fail to recognize God's presence. And when we start to hit those snags, we also tend to do something that Ahasuerus does. And that's to foolishly overreact when bad things happen. Have you ever been there? Have you ever done that? We don't necessarily recognize God's presence, so we say, it's up to me, so I better fix this. And in fixing it, we go too far the other direction, right? And we try to overcompensate or overreact to a situation. And basically, when we don't recognize God and his presence, we make rash decisions. We take bad advice sometimes from other people, right? We follow that, and we say, well, I got to make something work. I mean, look at our world today. This is our world in a nutshell, is foolish overreactions, isn't it? People see one thing and it says something in a book. Oh, let's ban all the books. Let's take them away, take them off the shelves. They're all no good. Or somebody says something somebody doesn't agree with. Oh, let's shut this person out, right? And we want to overreact. Oh, well, this person said this thing. Well, let's do the opposite because that must be wrong. And they go so far in the other direction that they're just as bad in the other direction because we foolishly overreact when we do it in our own strength, when we miss God and we don't see his presence. And that's what's happening here. The truth is, when we don't recognize that God is with us, we tend to try to go it alone, right? And that's what we see here in chapter 1. And that's where they say, well, let's banish the queen disrespected you. We don't care that she's beautiful and she's got a beautiful, let's just banish her. We'll find a different one, And then, we feel a little disrespected. Well, instead of us being the husbands we're supposed to be, let's just make a law. That'll solve it. Because laws solve everything, don't they? So anyway, again, we don't recognize God and that he's with us. We tend to go it alone with our own feeble and flawed wisdom. And we often make a bigger mess of things. And that's what's happening here. is a bigger mess of things. And then finally, we see here that we tend to do all we can and to be more concerned with protecting our own kingdom rather than supporting God's kingdom. When we fail to recognize God's presence and we kind of go down that cycle where it's about our works and then about our wisdom, and we start to build all of this, then we start to say, well, this is about my reputation. I got to defend this. And this is what's behind all that Ahasuerus is doing. He deposes Vashti, and he makes this law because his reputation took a hit. He says, I have to protect my reputation. Have you ever been there? I know I've been there, where somebody offends us, or somebody offends me, and I'm more concerned that I got slighted than maybe when God gets slighted by someone. And somebody offends God, and I don't come to God's defense. Rather, but I'll leap to mine. Wait a minute, you can't say that about, that's my name. And we tend to kind of fall into that when we don't recognize God is present and God's presence in our lives. So that's kind of what we see here happening, right? And when we don't recognize his work in and through us, we tend to think, that we did something to earn all of this. So we feel, well, I have a lot to lose then. If I build all this, then I have a lot to lose, so I need to protect it. However, when we can recognize instead God's work and that he's present, you know what we can do? We get to rest in him. We get to rest in his control. We get to rest in his plans. We get to trust that he has us. He makes us who we are and who he wants us to be. So, we can learn this lesson at least, some of these warning signs for when we fail to recognize God's presence in our lives. And that's some good practical stuff, isn't it? But the point of chapter 1 is bigger than this. It's much bigger than this. And it's much better. There's something even more significant happening here in the first chapter of Esther. And here's what I really want you to see. And the key to it all is in verse 19. Look back at verse 19. And it's where where Memucan's talking about banishing Vashti, right? And if you look down at the end of verse 19, the last line of verse 19 says this. So they say, we want her to put her away. She can never come before you as queen or anything like that. And then he says, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Find yourself a new and better queen. And who could this be? It's Esther. And the really cool thing about this is that what Ahasuerus and his advisors are thinking, a newer, better queen, basically somebody who's just as beautiful but is submissive to you, will do what you want. But that's not the meaning of better from God's perspective. You see, what he's basically saying is, that better, when we get to the end of Esther, we're going to see, is God's way. That's why Queen Esther was a better way. So we're going to find you someone better than she, better because it's God's way. You see, here's what's going on in chapter 1 of Esther. You have all of these feasts that are going on and all of this drama surrounding these feasts. But at the same time, behind the scenes, God is setting the table for his own grand feast, where he will be sharing his never-ending faithfulness. So see, behind the scenes, God's preparing another feast. And this feast is of his faithfulness. So he's setting the table. So chapter 1, just think of it in terms of God is setting the table. He's beginning to work in this situation. And you're going to have to wait to see how it plays out. But anyway. So basically in the midst of all this pride, in the midst of overreactions, broken relationships that are on display here in chapter 1, God has paved the way for the rescue of his people. See, Esther couldn't become queen if Vashti was still queen. King wouldn't be looking for something different if all of this hadn't happened, if he hadn't got bad advice and been affronted and all of these things that you say, well, that's a coincidence. In Esther, there are no coincidences. It's all God. You see, even in those times, even in our lives, where we feel like God is nowhere and we're in the crisis, we can know that God is now here. God is now here. He's working, and he's always faithful to accomplish what he desires for us. And when we fail to recognize his presence, we can make a real mess of our lives. But when we trust that he is here, we have hope to go through anything. So this is our takeaway from chapter 1 of Esther, where we see God beginning by setting the table for his grand feast. And I bet you can't wait to see what happens next week. Because Esther, each chapter is a cliffhanger. So again, it's great drama. And hopefully it leaves you hanging. What's going to happen next? We'll find out next week. Okay? Let's pray.